My parents spent $50,000 on my sister's graduation party, but when I earned my plumbing license, all I got was a polite smile and, "That's nice, dear." That single phrase, soft, rehearsed, and dripping with condescension, stuck with me longer than any champagne toast they raised for Natalie Blake, MBA. My name is Jordan Blake, and I've spent my life with dirt under my nails and proof of worth measured not in degrees but in calluses. In Naperville, image mattered. My father, Peter, loved clean suits and clean reputations. My mother, Diane, loved the kind of success you could frame and post online. I learned early that working with my hands didn't fit their idea of achievement. Natalie was the golden child, sharp, articulate, endlessly praised. I was the practical one, the daughter who fixed things. For them, my job was a backup plan. For me, it became a boundary. Years blurred into quiet resentment. They hosted parties under chandeliers while I unclogged drains in frozen basements. I stopped expecting applause. Still, the memory of that party never left me. The band, the flowers, the 50 grand poured into validation. Then, years later, one winter night, validation froze inside their own walls. Pipes burst in my parents' basement, flooding the same floor where family portraits once hung. Mom called, voice trembling, begging for help. For the first time, I didn't reach for my wrench. I reached for my price list. If you've ever been underestimated for choosing a different path, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe, because sometimes the sweetest revenge is knowing exactly what your worth costs. Some choices announce themselves quietly, without drama, just a sentence dropped into a dinner table conversation that ends up rearranging an entire life. Mine began the night I told my family I wasn't going to college. I was 17, certain of only one thing: I wanted to work with my hands. While my classmates circled universities on glossy brochures, I circled tools in a trade school catalog. Pipes, valves, heating systems, they made sense to me in a way textbooks never had. I wanted to build, to repair, to make something that actually worked when I was done. Peter Blake, my father, believed success came with a degree and a pressed shirt. Diane Blake, my mother, believed in appearances, the kind that could be photographed and shared at luncheons. Natalie Blake, my older sister, already embodied both ideals. A scholarship student at business school, charming, articulate, praised at every family gathering. I didn't envy her, but I could feel the gravity she held in that house, pulling every conversation toward her orbit. When I mentioned Harrison Technical Institute, I saw the air change. Dad's fork paused mid-bite. Mom's smile froze halfway between approval and disbelief. Natalie's expression softened into something that looked almost like pity. They didn't argue, not yet. That was the problem. Silence was worse than scolding. It meant they were calculating how far their expectations had fallen. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how quickly my decision became the family's quiet embarrassment. My name disappeared from their conversations about future plans. When Mom met her friends at the cafe, she spoke proudly about Natalie's internships but skipped over me entirely. At dinner, Dad talked about business trends, looking past me as if I weren't there. The message was clear. My path didn't fit their narrative. Trade school wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The first time I learned to solder a copper joint without burning it, I felt something ignite inside me, a satisfaction that no grade or trophy had ever matched. My hands ached, my jeans were stained, and for once, I didn't care. Hard work left proof. The contrast at home deepened with every passing month. Natalie came home for holidays in crisp suits, carrying stories about case studies and networking events. I came home smelling like metal and detergent. She got nods of approval, I got polite avoidance. When I bought my first set of professional tools, Mom called them cute. Dad asked if I'd thought about backup plans. Their words weren't cruel, but they carved little dents into me, small reminders that pride and disappointment could coexist under the same roof. By the time I finished my 2-year program, I had a license, a job offer, and a wallet full of calluses. Natalie had a new internship in Chicago and another round of applause from our parents. Her achievements filled the living room walls in framed certificates. Mine stayed folded in a drawer in my apartment. One afternoon, I visited home after fixing a leaking valve at a nearby shop. I still had grease under my nails. Mom handed me lemonade, careful not to touch my hands. She asked if I was still doing the plumbing thing. I nodded, too tired to explain that it wasn't a phase. Dad talked about Natalie's upcoming presentation at her firm. Mom glowed with pride. I stood in the kitchen doorway, invisible, listening to their words flow around me like water seeking lower ground. I realized then that our family had quietly split into two directions, one polished, one practical. I didn't resent Natalie. I resented the hierarchy built around her. She represented the story they wanted to tell the world, while I represented the one they wished to edit out. In that house, love came with conditions, respect came with a title. That night, back in my apartment, I stared at the calloused lines on my palms. They didn't look like failure to me. They looked like proof. Still, a small part of me ached for the kind of validation that money could buy, the kind they reserved for framed diplomas and catered parties. I told myself it didn't matter. But somewhere deep down, I already knew this fracture would widen. Families rarely break with a shout. Sometimes, they just stop hearing each other's worth. And that silence, that quiet, suffocating silence, was the first real crack in our foundation. The invitation arrived in a gold-foiled envelope thick enough to feel expensive just holding it. Inside, a card announced, Natalie Blake, MBA, in embossed letters, as if her degree were now part of her identity. The words shimmered under the light like a trophy. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because I was impressed, but because I could already hear the echo of my parents' laughter drifting through the printed gold. The event was hosted at the Chicago Country Club, a place where everything smelled of privilege and polished wood. $50,000, my mother, Diane Blake, mentioned casually when describing the live band and catering. It wasn't bragging, it was pride disguised as inevitability. My father, Peter Blake, had negotiated the wine list himself. He liked things that proved his taste. They said it was for Natalie, but it felt like a performance for everyone else. On the night of the party, I stood outside the venue in my one formal outfit, a simple black dress that looked understated beside the sea of sequins and suits. My hands still bore faint traces of work, tiny cuts that no amount of lotion could hide. Inside, the chandeliers burned too bright, the music too smooth, and every conversation seemed to orbit my sister. Natalie had always known how to command a room. She floated through clusters of guests with champagne in hand, smiling in ways that belonged in magazines. The applause followed her like perfume. When people turned toward me, their smiles faltered, polite but uncertain. I was the contrast. They didn't know what to do with the daughter who fixed leaks instead of leading meetings. My parents radiated pride, the kind that glowed under expensive lighting. When they spoke of Natalie, their voices lifted. When they looked at me, their tones softened into politeness. At one point, my mother's friend asked what I did these days, and my answer plumbing hung in the air like a punchline without laughter. I smiled anyway, but something in me hardened. The party unfolded like a film I'd already seen. Toasts, laughter, a slideshow of Natalie's achievements projected across the ballroom wall. I recognized the background music. It was the same instrumental piece my mother played at family dinners, the one she said sounded accomplished. I wondered what sound she associated with me. Probably the hum of a water heater. Halfway through the evening, I slipped away to the edge of the terrace. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the frozen golf course. I thought about the years I'd spent underground, literally crawling through crawl spaces, fixing pipes that no one ever saw, doing work that only mattered when it failed. Inside, success was being toasted with crystal glasses. Outside, mine existed quietly, measured in the simple fact that I paid my bills without help. When I returned to my table, a small white envelope sat beside my plate. My name was written neatly across the front. Inside was a folded note and a $50 bill. Congratulations on your certification. We're proud of you. That was all. No signature, no warmth, just that single line. I stared at the bill until the numbers blurred. $50. 50,000 for her, 50 for me. The math had never been clearer. I could have left then, and part of me wanted to. But something kept me seated, a quiet defiance, maybe. If they were going to display success, I would let them see what they ignored. I stayed through the speeches, through the applause, through the final toast where my father called Natalie the pride of our family. The words landed heavy, but not unexpected. They were confirmation of what I'd always known. Later that night, when the hall emptied and the music softened into background chatter, I found myself in front of the ballroom's mirrored wall. For a moment, I caught my reflection, same black dress, same weary hands, same quiet composure. Behind me, Natalie posed for another photo with our parents, their smiles perfect and practiced. I watched them without resentment, just a strange kind of distance, as though I'd already stepped out of their frame. The next morning, I drove back to my small apartment. I didn't cry. Instead, I took that $50 bill, slid it into a simple frame, and hung it above my workbench. It looked almost ceremonial against the rough wood. Not a reminder of insult, but of clarity. Some people measured success in degrees. I measured mine in independence. Each morning after, when I tightened bolts or installed fixtures, my eyes would catch the faint glint of that frame. It grounded me. It reminded me that recognition could be hollow, that family pride could come with conditions, and that value wasn't always something you were given, it was something you had to claim. Years would pass before I saw the true cost of their celebration, but that night, as the city slept and the frame hung silently on my wall, I understood something fundamental. Love in my family had a price tag, and mine had been discounted. Some lives grow in silence, built one small decision at a time. Mine began in a rented garage behind a hardware store, with a second-hand toolbox and a name I painted by hand on a white van, Blake Plumbing and Heating. The letters weren't even straight, but they were mine. There was a peculiar satisfaction in creating something tangible, something that didn't require anyone's permission to exist. Every job finished, every pipe sealed, every client satisfied, it became a language I understood better than any conversation with my parents. In those early years, I lived simply. A small apartment above a laundromat, cheap coffee, long hours. Success didn't come with applause. It came with calluses and receipts. My friend Tessa, who'd studied alongside me at trade school, sometimes helped when I was overloaded with jobs. She was sharp, fearless, and unbothered by judgment. We joked that the world only noticed us when something broke. Still, there was dignity in fixing what others ignored. Meanwhile, Natalie Blake was thriving in her polished world. She posted photos of corporate retreats and downtown brunches, each one tagged with motivational quotes. Mom and Dad adored those updates. They liked proof, something they could show off at church or dinner parties. My business didn't translate as easily into Facebook captions. Pipes didn't sparkle like diplomas. Occasionally, I'd receive calls from home, not for conversation but for comparison. "Natalie just bought a condo," Mom would say, her tone gliding between pride and reminder. I would respond politely, never mentioning that I'd just hired my first apprentice or paid off the loan on my van. They didn't ask, and I didn't offer. Years passed this way, steady, unremarkable, peaceful in its own rhythm. My company grew to 3 employees and 2 vans. I learned to navigate invoices, licensing renewals, and the quiet joy of providing honest work. Each project left me exhausted and content in equal measure. Sometimes, when I saw my reflection in a client's polished faucet, I thought about how far I'd come. I didn't need validation anymore. At least, that's what I told myself. Then, during one rare family dinner, the illusion cracked. We met at Peter Blake's insistence, a formal gathering at a restaurant too expensive for what it served. Natalie arrived late, glowing as always, her designer coat still carrying the faint scent of perfume and success. She spoke about her firm's expansion plans, about promotions and potential bonuses. I sat across from her, quiet, the smell of industrial soap still clinging to my hands. Dad asked Natalie about profit margins, about market growth, about whether she planned to buy a second property. When the conversation turned toward me, it was softer, almost an afterthought. "Still running your little business?" he asked. Little. The word landed like dust on something I'd spent years polishing. I smiled, the way you do when you realize it's not worth correcting. It wasn't cruelty, it was conditioning. To them, what I did was service work, not achievement. And yet, I went home that night more determined than ever to expand, not for pride, but for permanence. Within a year, I had a small office space with an actual sign. Clients began recommending me to friends. Realtors added me to their emergency contact lists. I hired 2 more employees. When Tessa and I secured a city contract for maintenance on a set of apartment complexes, it felt like crossing an invisible line between surviving and succeeding. Money no longer scared me. I bought a modest house in the Naperville suburbs. With a basement, I renovated myself dry, functional, warm. I didn't tell my parents. They found out months later, when a neighbor mentioned seeing my van parked outside. Mom called, her voice tight with surprise, and said, "We didn't know you'd done so well." I just said, "You never asked." We spoke less after that. Holiday invitations became optional, then occasional. When we did meet, I noticed how Natalie's tone toward me shifted from dismissive to cautious curiosity. She'd ask about the plumbing thing, with that same polite detachment Mom used years before, but now with a hint of unease, like she was realizing stability didn't always wear a suit. As my business grew, so did the distance between us. I didn't resent it anymore. I accepted it. Family had become an echo of obligation, not affection. They had their version of success, and I had mine. The two rarely met, except in comparison. Yet, some part of me still watched their curated happiness from afar. The posts, the trips, the parties, it was all so glossy. Beneath that shine, I suspected fragility, but I didn't care to look closer. I had pipes to fix, employees to pay, and homes to keep dry. My life moved in straight lines, logical and steady, built on labor instead of illusion. Sometimes at night, I'd sit in my workshop, the hum of equipment around me, the framed $50 bill still hanging where it always had. I'd glance at it and feel an odd peace. It wasn't anger anymore, it was recognition. I had built everything they said wasn't enough, and it was more than enough for me. But success has a way of circling back, testing the boundaries you've built. And though I didn't know it then, life was already preparing the stage for another kind of reckoning, one that would prove not just my worth but theirs. Winter in Naperville has a way of silencing everything. Snow falls thick, blanketing the streets, muting sound, softening the world until even time seems to hold its breath. That evening, I had finished my last call, packed my tools, and promised myself a quiet holiday. The van was parked, the lights were dim, and the air carried that sharp December stillness that makes you feel suspended between exhaustion and peace. Then my phone rang. The name Diane Blake flashed across the screen, an emergency disguised by familiarity. I hesitated, thumb hovering, every instinct whispering that peace never lasts long when family is involved. When I answered, the noise on the other end shattered the stillness. Her voice was panic-high, trembling, words spilling over themselves. The basement was flooding, water pouring through the ceiling, Dad shouting, chaos. For a moment, I just listened. It was the sound of everything they'd built, drowning. Years of habit took over. I told her to shut off the main valve near the water heater, to twist clockwise until it stopped. I could hear confusion, then shouting, then silence. The flow must have stopped. When her voice returned, it was smaller, shaking, full of fear. They needed help. Nobody else was answering. It was Christmas Eve. I sat there in my dark kitchen, staring at the snow pressing against the window, phone still in my hand. Somewhere inside, I could feel an old version of myself, the daughter desperate to be useful, rising again. But another part of me, the woman who'd built something from nothing, remembered the framed $50 bill, the polite neglect, the parties I was never celebrated at. Their emergencies had always been mine to fix. But this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be their solution. Still, I pulled on my coat and stepped into the cold. The air bit at my face as I crossed the driveway, my boots crunching over snow that sparkled under the streetlights. The van started reluctantly, engine grumbling like it resented the interruption. The drive felt longer than it was, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the storm. My hands gripped the wheel, steady, even as thoughts spun like the tires beneath me. Their house appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac, glowing gold and quiet, the picture of holiday serenity from the outside. You would never know there was disaster inside. I parked at the curb, engine idling, and stared at the place that had raised me and rejected me all at once. The same porch light that once guided me home now looked sterile, cold. Inside, the warmth hit like a wall, humid, chaotic, smelling of wet carpet and panic. The floor squelched beneath my boots. The air carried that sickly scent of soaked drywall, the heaviness of damage you can't undo. Peter Blake was pacing, his shoes wet, his expression tight. Mom hovered by the stairs, eyes wide, sweater soaked at the hem. They looked smaller than I remembered, fragile against the mess. My eyes traced the destruction. Water pooling along the baseboards, streaks running down the walls, ornaments scattered from the toppled tree. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd built their world on perfection, and here it was collapsing, one leaking joint at a time. Training kicked in automatically. I moved through the motions, surveying the main line, checking for ruptures, estimating the scope. But I wasn't here as their daughter anymore. I was a professional. Years of work had earned me the right to name my worth, and I would. When I opened my tablet to calculate, the number came clear and cold. $15,000. It wasn't revenge, it was business. Emergency rates, holiday surcharges, water extraction, labor. The total reflected the time, the equipment, the years it took to become the person capable of fixing what they couldn't. Standing there, I imagined the party from years ago, the glow of chandeliers, the laughter, the cost. $50,000 for celebration, $15,000 for salvation. The math was poetic. Mom's face trembled between gratitude and disbelief. She looked at me as though waiting for compassion to override calculation. But compassion had been spent long ago, slowly drained by years of dismissal. Dad said nothing, just stared at the figure on the screen as though it were written in another language. The silence between us was the same one that had lived in that house for decades, unspoken, heavy, filled with things none of us were brave enough to say. But tonight, I wasn't that silent daughter anymore. I was a woman standing in a flooded room, holding the price of their neglect in her hands. I wrote the quote, signed my name, and left it on the counter. There was no need for argument. Water damage doesn't negotiate. I told them I'd wait in the van until they decided. Outside, the storm had grown thicker, swallowing the world in white. The snowflakes fell heavy, clinging to my jacket, melting against the heat that pulsed from my skin. Sitting behind the wheel, I watched the lights flicker through the fogged glass. I imagined them inside whispering about betrayal, about family, about cost. But the truth was simple. This was the first time the value of my work exceeded the weight of their pride. Minutes passed, then longer. No call came, no message. The house stayed silent, except for the faint hum of my van heater. I waited, not for their approval, but for my own resolve to settle. For once, I didn't want to be needed. I wanted to be chosen, and they never had. When I finally turned the key and drove away, the storm swallowed the sound of the tires. Behind me, the house stood still, wrapped in gold light and water damage, its warmth fading into the snow. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the radiator. Somewhere inside, I felt the faint echo of justice, cold, clean, and overdue. In the weeks after that frozen night, silence became the language between us. No calls came, no emails, no apologies wrapped in polite phrasing. I didn't expect them. The invoice sat unpaid for 2 weeks, then 3, before a check arrived in the mail. No note, no signature beyond what the bank required. I cashed it without hesitation. It wasn't closure, it was confirmation. The repair had been done by another company, one that charged less and left the job unfinished. I knew because a month later, the city inspection reports crossed my desk, part of the maintenance contracts I handled. Their address was listed in the record, flagged for water damage violations. I stared at the line of text longer than I should have, then closed the file. Some lessons arrive as bills, others as consequences. Meanwhile, the winter melted into a gray, indifferent spring. My business thrived, insulated from drama by the rhythm of honest work. I hired 2 more technicians, invested in better trucks, upgraded the logo that had once been hand-painted and crooked. Each change felt like a layer of distance between who I'd been and who I'd become. Then, one quiet afternoon, an email appeared. The sender's name stopped me, Natalie Blake. The subject line read, "Need your advice." I opened it, not out of curiosity but out of instinct. Her message was polite, almost professional, asking if I could recommend a contractor for an office renovation. She'd left her firm, apparently, after a restructuring. I recognized the phrasing. It was the corporate way of saying failure. For a moment, I hovered over the reply button. Part of me considered answering, helping out the way family used to. But another part, older, steadier, colder, remembered the party, the applause, the quiet dismissal. I closed the email without typing a word. Some requests don't deserve responses. Weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Peter Blake's company had downsized. Retirement hadn't been kind to him. The markets shifted, the deals dried up. My mother, Diane Blake, took on part-time work with a community fundraiser, her voice still carrying that same practiced charm but thinner now, tired at the edges. Life was teaching them what I'd learned years earlier. Reputation is fragile when built on the illusion of control. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. There's a quiet dignity in watching truth reveal itself without interference. Still, I couldn't help but notice how poetic it felt, how the cracks beneath their perfect surface were finally visible to everyone else. Sometimes, I'd drive past the old house on my way to a job site. The once pristine lawn had faded, the shutters chipped, the perfection unraveling thread by thread. The new owners had installed solar panels and repainted the porch, but I could still see ghosts of our family in its walls, portraits, laughter, hierarchy. The ghosts didn't haunt me, they educated me. One evening, while reviewing client reports, I came across another email, this time from Mom. It was brief. "Hope you're well. We miss you. Let's talk." I read it 3 times, trying to find sincerity between the lines. There was none. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about comfort. Age softens regret, but not accountability. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed my laptop and walked into my workshop. The framed $50 bill still hung in its place, untouched by time. Beneath it, my first wrench, dulled by years but still solid. They were relics of both insult and independence. I ran my fingers over the frame, feeling the faint scratch of glass. For the first time, I realized it wasn't bitterness. I felt it was balance. Natalie's life continued unraveling quietly. A failed startup, a short-lived engagement, a relocation to another city. Mom mentioned it once in passing during a mutual acquaintance's wedding, as if testing whether I'd care. I didn't. Success and failure weren't currencies I traded in anymore. Peace was. One night, snow returned to Naperville, heavy and silent, just like that Christmas Eve. I stood by my window, watching flakes settle on the railing. Somewhere out there, my family existed in fragments, distant, disjointed, human. I didn't wish them harm. I simply wished them truth. The phone on my counter buzzed once, screen lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I thought of answering, thought of what might happen if I broke the silence. But then I remembered, not all repairs require reconnection. Some things are meant to stay broken, because the fracture itself holds the story. I turned the phone face down and went back to my desk. The night hummed softly, steady, forgiving. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand, doesn't punish, just exists. In that stillness, I finally understood the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. Forgiveness is peace, forgetting is permission, and I wasn't granting permission anymore. The world outside was still cold, but inside, warmth radiated from the work I'd built, the life I'd chosen, the self I'd repaired. I didn't need validation, family pride, or apology. I had something sturdier, proof that the foundation I'd built alone could weather anything. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. Years passed quietly, like pages turning without sound. My business became steady, my routines predictable, my life my own. Success no longer felt like something to chase. It simply existed, as natural and constant as breath. Sometimes, I still thought of Peter Blake, of Diane Blake, of Natalie Blake, not with anger, but with the detached compassion you reserve for people who never learned the language of humility. They were no longer villains in my story, just characters who'd reached their own inevitable endings. Dad's health declined slowly, like a structure collapsing one beam at a time. I learned about it from a neighbor, not from them. He passed quietly in a nursing facility miles away, surrounded by caretakers who were paid to listen. There was no funeral notice, no invitation. I didn't attend. Death doesn't erase history, it just silences it. Mom sold the old house soon after. The same walls that once echoed with judgment now stood empty, waiting for someone else's laughter. I drove past it once, just to see. The new owners had repainted the shutters, replaced the porch lights. The ghosts were gone, or maybe they had finally stopped looking for me. Natalie reached out one last time, a short letter, handwritten, neat as always. She said she'd found work teaching business courses at a community college. She said she hoped I was well. I didn't reply. Not because I hated her, but because the silence had finally become sacred. Some connections are best preserved as memories rather than repaired as obligations. I often wondered what they told people about me now. Maybe they said I'd moved away, or that I was busy, or that we'd grown apart. None of those were lies, not really. Distance isn't always measured in miles, it's measured in peace. In my workshop, the framed $50 bill still hung above the bench. It had become less of a symbol of insult and more of a relic of origin. The ink had faded slightly, the glass dusty at the corners, but it remained. A reminder that sometimes the smallest dismissals plant the deepest roots of resilience. Looking back, I realized revenge had never been the point. It wasn't about making them pay, it was about making myself whole. The sweetest form of justice was simply living untouched by their approval, existing beyond the reach of their expectations. My independence wasn't rebellion, it was survival matured into wisdom. The world around me kept spinning, clients calling, tools humming, days folding into each other. Yet every so often a moment would stop me. The quiet drip of a faucet, the hum of the heater, the reflection of my own face in a polished pipe. I'd see the same determination in my eyes that once felt like defiance but now felt like peace. People often say family is forever, but I've learned that isn't always true. Blood ties are not guarantees, they're invitations. You choose whether to attend, whether to stay, whether to keep bleeding for people who never learned how to heal themselves. Sometimes walking away isn't abandonment, it's evolution. My story doesn't end with reconciliation or regret. It ends with balance, the kind that doesn't need applause, doesn't crave understanding. I built a life that functions solid, clean, reliable the way a well-made plumbing system should. Every part serving its purpose. No leaks, no noise, no waste. When clients thank me now, I smile not just for the work done, but for what it represents. Stability, integrity, control. The things my childhood lacked, I built into my adulthood with intention. Every wrench turned was a sentence in my new language of self-worth. Sometimes new apprentices ask about the framed bill. I tell them it was payment for the first lesson life gave me, that the world won't always see your value, and it doesn't have to. Your worth isn't up for debate. It's in the work, in the discipline, in the peace you create when no one's watching. They nod, not fully understanding yet, but they will. On quiet nights, I sit by the window with a cup of tea, the hum of the furnace steady beneath the floorboards. Outside, the world is calm, snow occasionally dusting the street. Inside, everything holds pipes, walls, heart. And if I ever think back to that party, that polished ballroom with its chandeliers and laughter, I feel nothing. Not anger, not pride, just distance measured not in time, but in growth. They had their celebration. I had my craft. And in the end, mine lasted longer. That, I think, is the true revenge, not destruction, not triumph, but the quiet certainty that you never needed them to define you. If there's one truth my life has taught me, it's this. Dignity doesn't come from who applauds you, but from who you become when no one is clapping. Respect earned through labor is worth more than love bought with spectacle. Sometimes the only way to fix what's broken is to stop returning to the leak. If this story spoke to something inside you, if you've ever found strength in walking away, like, share, and subscribe. Because peace isn't found in revenge, it's found in finally being free.